Jacksonville. The child was born and couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts for poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. With Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talked for hours. It was a barefoot history in this land of flowers.
The weekend was on the 1st of December 2018, beaming from WBRNRadio and on the Boston Red Network. We have with sadness the death of President Bush, George H.W. Bush. I'll read a little bit of it from the Dallas Morning News. This is by Todd Gilman. Nonetheless, former President George Bush, a war veteran and father of a president and founder of the modern Texas Republican Party, who presided over monumental global changes, died on Friday at 84. Bush died after 10 p.m. Funeral arrangements to be announced at a later time. That is from one of his press people. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or a daughter could ask. But that was from former President G.W. Bush. Said in a written statement, the entire Bush family is deeply grateful for number 41's life and love, and for the compassion of those who cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens. Bush's health already fragile. The heartbreak this spring of losing his first lady and wife of 73 years hit hard. Barbara Bush died on April 17th at 92. He was hospitalized a day after the funeral with a serious blood infection, but recovered. Uh-oh. We got kind of carried away here with our pointer. Bush viewed government as a noble calling, as former President Gerald Ford remarked in 1997, opening the Bush Library at Texas A&M University, which houses the Bush School of Government and Public Service. In George Bush's America, civility is never confused with weakness, nor are political differences mistaken for a holy war. That's what President Ford said, who died in 2006. In George Bush's America, there is no political enemies, merely adversaries who may disagree with you on one day and yet be with you on the next roll call. His life is a testimony that public service is a noble calling. President Barack Obama, a Democrat, said on February 2011, as he bestowed a Medal of Freedom on President Bush, the highest civilian honor. At an emotional White House ceremony, President Obama lauded Bush for service and sacrifice and spoke of his humanity and decency, something lost in today's world. This is a gentleman inspiring citizens to become points of life in service to others. When Bush turned 85 in 2009, he jumped from a plane. Tandem landed on his own lawn in Maine and properly placed a kiss on his bride. He made one of the last jumps at 90. In the later years, he became known for his colorful socks. He wore a pair adorned with books to Barbara's funeral, in mind of her devotion to the cause of literacy and devotion, and his devotion to her. Our family had a front row seat for most of the amazing love story, Jeb Bush said at his mother's funeral. Bush told biographers that Trump lacked the humanity and requirement of a good president. He called his eventual successor a blowhard and cast his own ballot for Democrat Hillary Clinton, a remarkable gesture for a man who chaired the national GOP. Bush won the presidency in 1988. We will all remember that, after serving 8 years as the vice president of Ronald Reagan. Historians consigned him to a modest place in history, calling Bush a footnote to the most significant two-term presidency of Reagan. He was really a third term whose basic role was to consolidate the gains of the Reagan era from George Edwards, president scholar at Texas A&M, for a decade and directed the university's Center for Presidential Studies. In terms of his goals, which were modest, and the situation he inherited, George Bush had to be considered at least one an adequate president with a decent record. But when it comes to the needs of the time, his rating may fall lower. There were genuine needs, and Bush was not oriented towards meeting them. Stephen Haas, former Republican White House aide, who studied the presidency studies the non-presidency at the nonpartisan Brookings Institute, said Bush was remembered as a transitional president. He came at the end of a conservative cycle in American history, and after a very innovative president who will be remembered in history. Unlike many presidents, Bush never wrote his own memoirs, and he rarely commented on issues involving his presidency of those who came after him, in part to avoid complicating his son's political career. That was G.W. Bush. During G.W. Bush's the presidency of G.W. Bush, some of his late father's former aides were outspoken against the invasion of Iraq, but the elder Bush avoided the spotlight and kept an input or complaints private. Occasional reports surfaced of instances in which his advice had been influential, and such as after the younger Bush reached an agreement with China to run the crew of a downed U.S. plane. That was in 2001. And he noted from time to time that economic boom that by the Clinton administration started on his watch. Decisions he made and had stood for a time, the younger Bush told the Dallas Morning News in 2014, after he wrote 41 Portrait of My Father, unique biography with one president as an orphan, another one as a subject. The research said of younger Bush left him impressed by his dad's willingness to take risks, joining the Navy during World War II and heading to West Texas to find fortune, because he was from Maine, seeking a Senate seat in Texas when Republicans were nearly a non-existence. He described a loving and nurturing home that gave the Bush children room to take risks on their own. And let me move along on this. America has led the world through In the age of global transition, he said, we made the world safer for our kids, and the real fruits of our global victory are yet to be tasted. President Bush talked about the New World Order. But here's a patrician manner left him politically vulnerable. A 1987 Newsweek cover story questioning his ability to overcome the wimp factor damaged him as it did the proposed amusement at a grocery store price scanner during the 1992 re-election campaign. Bush returned to Houston after leaving the White House, living there during the winter and spending the summers in Kennebunkport. After devastating tsunami in Indonesia in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Bush worked closely on relief efforts with the man who ousted him. He and President Clinton became so close that G.W. Bush began to quirk that Clinton became like the son his father had always wanted. That was G.W. Bush. In 2011, at the Kennedy Center Gala promoting Bush's call to volunteerism, Clinton recalls that Bush only requested that the 92 election was that Clinton preserve the Points of Life initiative in a program that evolved into AmeriCorps. I'd forgotten that. In the fall of 2017, complaints... Well, anyway, we'll skip that. The leadership style critics accused Bush of offering timid leadership in many major issues, especially at home. Bush acknowledged a preference for prudence and caution. Still, he showed a flair for dramatics. He secretly arranged a 1989 summit with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. He sent troops to oust the Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega, who's dead, preceded him, and he presided over the nation's swiftest and most successful military in decades as a coalition-led liberated Kuwait after an invasion by President Saddam Hussein, who is also dead. And let me just get this part here. What happened on election day? The economic slump. Bush provided less successful in containing the economic prosperity that marked much of Reagan's term. But it was up and down during Reagan's term also. The national economy grew. Growth hit lows not seen since the Hoover administration 60 years earlier. The last 2 years of President Bush's term were marred by the most stubborn recession since World War II. His approval rating plummeted from 90% at the end of the Gulf War to 50%. That's better than D.J. Trump. He tried to jumpstart his popularity in the economy by calling his, in his 1992 State of the Union speech for Americans to bring the same common purposes to the economic problems they did to the war. He publicly doubted, public doubts remained. He faced a primary challenge from the conservative commentator Pat Buchanan, who held Bush to a lackluster victory in a kickoff, a New Hampshire primary. Buchanan later was to drop out without a single vote. More damaging was a challenge from independent candidate Ross Perot, the Dallas billionaire businessman. Once Clinton secured the nomination, Bush lead vanished. On election day, he drew 37.4% of the vote, and worst showing by a president seeking re-election 80 years. Ross Perot drew 19%, enough in the views of many Republicans to cost Bush the election. Clinton do just 43%, and comfortable, but the electoral vote was different. 337 to 168 victory there. Before turning over the White House, Bush had work to do. He sent 28,000 U.S. troops to Somalia to guarantee the safety of food shipments. He completed the second strategic arms reduction treaty with the then President Boris Yeltsin. His New England upbringings, he was born in Milton, Mass. Wait a minute, just a second here. Just hit a little bit of this. In Milton, Mass. On June the 12th, 1924. Though they had New England roots, Bush's parents grew up in the Midwest. I didn't know that. Prescott Bush was a right-winger, was born in Columbus, Ohio, and met his future wife, Dolly Walker, in St. Louis, where she was working for the Simon Hardware Company after graduating from Yale, and he was working, for the Simmons Hardware Company after graduating Yale and Harvard Law School. She had been born in Maine, where her family had a big summer home that became the Bush's favorite spot. Like his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy, Bush had a privileged upbringing, educated at the Greenwich Country Day School, Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass., and Yale University. His boyhood heroes were Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and the well-known athletes. Bush was a first baseman. He was captain also of the Yale baseball team, and played the first College World Series. He often went with his father to Yankee Stadium to watch his idol, Lou Gehrig. His mother, Bush later recalled, taught him Christian values. She was very religious in that sense, and she taught us sportsmanship, to do your best work, hard work, and kindness. Bush picked up that early, being known for his generosity. Even as a boy, the young George Bush would turn to the person next to him and say, "Hey, have a half." Another nickname that stuck with him was Poppy. The main thing he got from his parents, he made clear in a 1986 interview, was not money but values. His father died, that was Prescott Bush, in 1972. Ideas he brought to the presidency. He lauded the Points of Life Foundation. His father represented Connecticut for 10 years in the Senate. When he was growing up, Bush noted that his father was involved mainly in local politics. Served in World War II. In the winter of 1942, he began flight training in Corpus Christi. That was his first visit to Texas. He went on to the Pacific theater there, according to the naval citation that accompanied his distinguished flying cross. Bush was hit at the start of his dive. Though his plane was on fire, Bush continued on the dive. He married in 1944 to Barbara Pierce. She was the daughter of the publisher of McCall magazine. It was a big magazine at the time. Bush left the Navy, resumed his life at Yale. He majored in economics and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. Joined the Skulls and Bones Society, much is made of that. He was interviewed by Procter & Gamble for its training program, and he considered trying a Rhodes Scholarship and spent a year at Oxford. I didn't know that. But he didn't see how he could do that and asked the family to support us. So, I just go out and get a job and go to work, he said. A close friend of his father's held head of a Dallas-based company called Drescher Industries, offered advice. What he ought to do is go out to West Texas and start a new oil field. He began as a sales type out in Odessa, Texas for $375 a month. Was quite a bit of money at the time. People who knew Bush then didn't expect him to pursue politics as a career. My dad was just retired from the Senate, Bush said. I'd go up there from time to time and meet some of the senators. I got increasingly frustrated. Democratic-dominated Texas it was at the time, and Harris County Republicans turned to Bush in 1962. A friend of his named Ashley from Yale and later a Democratic congressman from Ohio recalled no particular political agenda. He ran against, incidentally, Ralph Yarborough. He campaigned against the limited test ban treaty. Bush faced a conservative opponent in the party in 1964. Even as he espoused conservative positions, he campaigned against the nuclear test ban treaty, Medicare, federal aid to local schools, and he called the 1964 Civil Rights Act unconstitutional. But he would in later years, before the Democrats lost their grip in Texas, Bush lost to Ralph Yarborough, taking 43% of the vote. Ralph Yarborough was a progressive in Texas. James Baker, later his top political advisor and campaign manager, had been Bush's partner in double tennis at the Houston Country Club. He was still a Democrat at the time. I'm not sure I even voted for him in 1964. 2 years later, Bush won a new created House district out of Houston, Texas. As a freshman, he was elected to the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee. To avoid any conflict of interest, he sold his holdings for $1.2 million. A little more than a year later, the assets would have been worth $8 million. So he was already a millionaire. When Richard Nixon won in 1968, the president nominated Bush to surface there. When Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president, and Ford, of course, chose finally Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller did get a vice president. Bush thought perhaps he would be looked upon. It's a difficult place, but he never let it show. I said Dallas, Washington lawyer Robert Strauss, otherwise known as Bob Strauss, he said to me, you think you've got problems, but he didn't whine or complain. Strauss is a Democratic chair, formed a close relationship with Bush, later served as his ambassador in Moscow. He died at 95, that's Bob Strauss, in March of 2014. Despite hundreds of speeches defending Nixon, Bush emerged politically unscathed with the gratitude of officials. His White House runs after Jimmy Carter ousted Ford, Bush returned to Texas and was inching towards a run for president. He told an interviewer, a long shot there, he derailed Reagan's proposals to cut the taxes to boost growth as voodoo economics. I remember that. He was quite honest about that one. That changed when Bush became a leading Democratic target in 1984. It was, Gold said later, the first serious encounter with negative press coverage had left him more suspicious and more cautious. As he approached the 88 race for the White House, Bush resisted the temptation to separate himself from Reagan. And Iran-Contra was out there to stir the GOP base. Bush stressed crime, and his rivals veto a measure requiring the this was his race against Governor Dukakis, the Pledge of Allegiance in Massachusetts. And no doubt they put here William Horton, a black murderer who escaped and raped a woman on a furlough during the caucus term as governor. Bush campaign manager influenced Lee Atwater. We talked about him. But the man's name was William Horton, not Willie Horton. The first 100 days moved quickly to set a different tone. He reached out to Democratic leaders in Congress. Critics accuse him of a weak response to China's crackdown on democracy. Democratic dictators, they call it democracy. Anyway, he kept his first year in office with a shipboard meeting with Chairman Gorbachev off of the Mediterranean Isle of Malta. Late in December, he sent troops into Panama. That was his one stab there. The war in Iraq, as his popularity slumped, Bush confronted the most significant foreign crisis of his tenure on August 2nd, 1990. Iraq launched a lightning takeover of Kuwait, which was actually part of it. Bush initially condemned the move, but said he was not contemplating U.S. intervention, but he began to move more strongly after meeting with the Iron Lady in Aspen, Colorado, Margaret Thatcher. By August the 5th, he vowed this will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. During the first 5 months, Bush sent more than a half million troops into the region and mobilized unprecedented international support. On January 17th, 1991, after the Iraq defied a so-called UN resolution, 5 weeks later, he followed up with a ground invasion that routed the Iraqis and brought the war to a stunning, swift conclusion. Iraq is liberated, he proclaimed on the 27th of February, that would have been 1991, our military objective is met. It was the peak of the Bush presidency, with public approval at 80%. He had a Democratic Congress and a more hostile Congress than Reagan had. That is from the presidential historian Brinkley. He was elected to carry out the policy of the Reagan years, but conditions changed, and this is very important here to remember. Conditions did in fact change. The U.S. was moving into a global economy, which Bush called the New World Order, and made those policies obsolete. The presidents are judged on whether they succeed in doing anything important. Affection from the public, a kind and gentle tone he pledged. That was in 1988. I remember a woman remarking to me that was on the day that he said those words, that we now have our country back. People actually saw President George H. Bush as a liberator from the right-wing Reagan administration. In 1986, he discovered that his vice presidential successor, Walter Mondale, planned to attend a law partner's working wedding on the weekend. Bush was going to Kennebunkport. He phoned and invited Mondale, who Reagan had crushed in the 94 election, to fly with him on Air Force Two. Mondale, he was a nice guy. He went out of his way to be nice. Gold, the former president age, theorized Bush's failure to win. Similar affection from the general public came from Bush's innate resentment of anything he thought self-serving or self-aggrandizing. Well, totally different from DJ Trump. His mother told him, don't be boastful. Don't brag on yourself. It is some of it is a conflict between a political person who likes attention and someone that fights everything that is staged. In the end, his failure to do enough to meet the nation's domestic needs doomed him to a one term. He gained some measure of vindication when his son defeated Reagan's vice president, actually stole the election from Albert Gore. That in his waning years was part of extraordinary ripple effect Bush had in his life. President Obama said he did not call one binding light shining from for one binding light shining from Washington. He didn't just call for a few bright lights from the biggest nonprofits. President Obama said he called for a vast galaxy of people and institutions working together to solve problems in their own backyard. 20 years later, think for a minute about the impact he has made. And Colin-Powell was one that also served in that particular capacity. Rest in peace, as one would say, to former President George H. Herbert Walker Bush. Anyway, nonetheless, let's segue to Uncle Carl. He's writing in the Wall Street Journal on the 29th of November. Bernie Sanders knows what he wants in the Washington Post op-ed last week. The Democratic Socialists from Vermont laid out a legislative agenda for the 116th Congress, first 100 days. Amongst them, a dazzling array of proposals. Sanders pushed for his signature Medicare for all, tuition-free college, student debt relief. Student debt relief will eventually get passed. Tax increases requiring wealthy people and large corporations to begin paying their fair share. That will be looked at. And a minimum wage of $15 an hour, indexed to minimum wage growth and not inflation. Others in the Democratic Party, increasingly influenced by the Democratic Socialist wing, in most places they'd be called Social Democrats. Anyway, are pressing for their own major legislation to pass, even if it goes nowhere in the Republican Senate. Representative-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, wants a Green New Deal, sounding too much like, oh boy, a Maoist functionary. That's a low blow from him. She describes it as a national industrial economic mobilization plan to make America carbon neutral. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez plan would end U.S. use of nuclear energy and fossil energy, coal, oil, and gas. Within 10 years, she promises to upgrade every residence and industry building for state-of-the-art, energy-efficient, comfort, and safety, virtually eliminating poverty by... and this is something that's being talked about, guaranteeing a living wage to every person who wants one, while migrating a deep, enhanced racial and regional gender bias, eradicating, migrating, he's called anyway, in income and wealth through a universal basic income, universal health care, and other measures. Republicans must resist this temptation to simply dismiss these radical ideas. They're not radical ideas. These ideas have been around since Harry S. Truman. Enthusiasm for socialism and antagonism to capitalism have surged amongst millennials and Gen Zers. State-run economics may have been discredited by the 20th century, but it doesn't mean new forms of socialism can't gain a following. Republicans must do the hard work in updating old arguments. Well, the old arguments are not working. This is what happened to former President George H. Bush. Taking a strong stance against ideas of Democratic parties, ascendant left could help congressional Republicans rehabilitate their image with the voters. This requires a sound arguments and careful marshaling of evidence. It means paying special attention to suburban voters who are center-right on economics but have turned against the Republicans in a midterm, upset about Washington's implacable partisanship and ugly tone. Well, without the ugly tone, and we'll get to that in a minute, the Republican message would be zero. Must communicate consistently and spread far and wide, from town meetings to speeches and press conference, from cable news to social media. Consider the argument against Medicare for all. Do voters really want to abolish private insurance? Medicare for all has not said that. After watching the Department of Veteran Affairs bungle the treatment of the nation's warriors, that has nothing to do with Medicare for all. The Republicans would like to privatize the Department of Veteran Affairs. That's something progressives have to make clear. Do Americans want their personal health decisions made by an unresponsive federal government? Do they want the waiting time, the decline in quality, and the slowing of innovation that would come with a takeover by a new government bureaucracy? And how will the country pay the $32 trillion cost for Medicare expansion? They will by cutting the military budget. The average working couple already pays $158,000 in Medicare taxes over their lifetime career. What I will notice for personal experience of the Medicare tax, for my own problems with prostate cancer, we've already spent Medicare funds over $100,000. So you can forget that one. They would like to see their taxes skyrocketed and their health care cut. And not cut health care. What they would do is move to preventive care. Democrats should be forced to answer for their radical, wild ideas. Well, these ideas will be will be debated in the Congress. New studies will come out, will address the $32 trillion. It's possible this approach will allow Democrats to set the terms of discussion, and it already has, because the Republicans are running around now claiming they are not against pre-existing conditions. But in fact, they are. They are going, in fact, the Trump administration, for so-called skinny insurance. Now, what that would do, that would not have pre-existing conditions, would not cover pre-existing conditions for a person, because a person would pay less, they would cover less, and many other things they would not cover, these so-called cheaper policies. Making the case against extreme ideas of Democratic socialists like Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez will require the Republican to rethink its politics, the GOP, I should say, and clarify its a conservative vision. The problem is, if the Republican Party clarifies its conservative positions, the Republican Party would itself melt away. That is what the problem would be. There's no doubt about that. Let me just jump once more here. If we can. Or we'll have to save it. Yeah, we can. This is the Republican Party at work from Facing South. And we appreciate Susan Sturgis here. This is on November the 30th. Corporations that helped a Confederate apology hold a Senate seat. This is old Cindy Hyde Smith there. She defeated, of course, Mike Espy. And this is wrong. The totals there. Mike Espy, actually, she got less than 55%. Won't worry about that. Is a former state senator, agriculture commissioner. She and her husband operate a cattle sales barn. I didn't know that. And she's a Democrat who switched parties in 2012. The runoff was last week, so despite competing in a Republican stronghold, Hyde Smith word her party by making controversial statements. We all know about that. If someone invited to a public hanging, she wouldn't be there. She was captured, of course, on the video and came under fire. She also was criticized for posing in a Confederate hat and holding a rifle at a visit to the Confederate President Jeff Davis's home in Biloxi, Mississippi. And with neo-Confederate activist Craig Stewart, who was previously associated with Free Mississippi, which the Southern Poverty Law Center classified as a hate group. But the hanging remark that triggered the backlash amongst some of her campaign financial supporters. She made the statement on the 2nd. A Louisiana blogger named Lamar White Jr. in the Bayou Brief put it out there. Not all the money ran from Hyde-Smith, though, fearing reprisal of Republican Roy Moore. Conservative groups dispatched the Republican Party, sent additional workers there. DJ Trump came there twice. Established in 1916 and recognized in 1948, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, a political committee that elects Republicans to Congress, currently chaired by Cory Gardner, who will be replaced in Colorado, and Thor Tillis of South Carolina, spent over $122 million. Remember that, $122 million. Top corporations contribute to the committee. The Koch Industries, based in Kansas, the infamous Koch brothers, formerly Wichita, Kansas, now Palm Springs and Palm Beach, Florida. Charles Schwab, Anheuser-Busch, that's InBev, who owns them. Marathon Petroleum, the Anschutz Entertainment Group, AEO Live, I'm not sure who they are, and various others. Senate Leadership Fund, on the other hand, is a super PAC. So in other words, they don't have to respond. It was created in 2015 by supporters of old Mitch McConnell. Its current president and CEO is Steve Laura, who served as McConnell's chief of staff there. The Leadership Fund is reported spending more than $90 million in this election cycle. Old Sheldon Adelson of Vegas, CEO of Vegas Sands, one of the big ones there, and his position wife, Marian Adelson, there. She gave her a Medal of Freedom. The Senate Leadership PAC, leading corporate donors, according to OpenSecrets.org, include the Pilot Corporation, which operates convenience stores, truck stops, ConocoPhillips, you'd expect them to be in there, Florida Light and Power and Light, and Chevron, that's of California. On the Democratic side, meanwhile, the Senate Majority PAC accounts for all or more of 873,000 in media buys opposing Hyde-Smith. The Super PAC was originally formed in 2010 as a common sense 10 by a former aides and advisor to Harry Reid. Top donors there: Mr. Bloomberg, Seth MacFarlane, Bill Mayer. They want to get him with Bill Mayer, the comedian, and George Soros. But what they're giving is just peanuts compared to what these other characters are giving. Let me just move on here. Check on the time here. We'll go to sports. We'll go to sports now. College basketball. This weekend we'll have number 1 Texas, number 5 Oklahoma. That'll be at 12 noon, the noon game. Then we'll have Drake and Iowa State. Also, I guess it's the same time. Memphis and UCF. Alabama and Georgia, that'll be at 4 p.m. number 1 Alabama and Georgia. Fresno State and Boise State, that'll be around 7:15 Eastern Time. Clemson and Pittsburgh at 8 o'clock. Northwestern and Ohio State at 8 p.m. And finally, Utah and Washington State. Well, that was already played. Sorry about that. Washington, the University of Washington, Seattle, 10-3 was the score there. And I have a little article here from ESPN about college football playoffs. Number 1 Alabama, number 2 Clemson, number 4 Georgia, number 5 Oklahoma, number 6 Ohio State, and number 8 UCF could still lose and provide a pitfall for the conference championship game. In 2005, Iowa dropped from 4 to 5 after losing the Big Ten championship. In 2017, Auburn, ranked number 2, sunk from number 2 to number 7 after losing the SEC championship. The same year, Wisconsin fell from number 4 to number 6 after losing to Ohio State. For those who want a playoff to expand, Clemson's coach Sweeney considers the ACC championship to be the fourth final. Oh, well, anyway. What happens if Alabama, Clemson, and all win? This would actually be the most likely scenario. This is Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. And according to the Power Index, there's a 38% chance they all win their respective conference titles. It would come down to Ohio State or Oklahoma for the 4th spot, although the Sooners have been ranked ahead of the Buckeyes. I think we talked about that before, and how this all turns out. Well, we don't know. We'll see, however, though. On to the NBA. Well, last night, the Cavaliers were in Boston. The Celtics won 28-95. The Jazz were at the Hornets. The Jazz won 19-111 for the Hornets. The Bulls were in the Motor City, and the Pistons 107-88 for the Bulls. The Wizards were in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. 76ers won 23-98. And in overtime, the Grizzlies were in Jersey. Grizzlies won 13-125 for the Nets. The Pelicans were at the Heat. Heat 105-100 for the Pelicans. The Hawks were at the Thunder in OKC. Thunder 124-109. The Rockets were at the Spurs. A battle of Texas in San Antonio. It was the Rockets 136-105. The Magic and Suns in Phoenix. Magic won 99-85. The Mavericks and Lakers. It was the Lakers 114-103. And the Nuggets and Trailblazers. A 1-point game there. Nuggets by 113-112. And to the National Hockey League. Sabres and Panthers. It was the Panthers 3-2 in overtime. The Devils and Capitals. It was Capitals 6-3 over the Devils. That's a final. The Anaheim Ducks and Hurricanes in an overtime. It was the Ducks 2-1. The Blues of St. Louis and the Avalanche again in an overtime. It was the Blues 3-2. And finally, the King and Flames. It was the Flames 4-1. This does it for the sports. We'll see you on the Monday morning quarterback. Also this weekend we'll have This Week in Economics. The numbers man part. I'm running out of my throat is beginning dry. Anyway, we'll finish this up and we'll talk about the economy. A lot of economic news out, and I believe a separate, or maybe we'll put them together, Chairman Jerome Powell at the Economics Club of New York. We may cut that in and cut out the Q&A something, and we'll have an open source report also. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on Monday morning on our political channel, Boston Red.